This is the last lecture on parental care, and we're going to talk about two additional topics associated with some kind of side issues of parental care, Siblicide and parental favoritism. So let's first talk about Siblicide. Parents sometimes let siblings fight for food and attack each other, which can lead to the death of one or more of the siblings associated with a reproductive effort. And this begs the question, why do the parents let this happen? Perhaps this is non-adaptive from the parent's perspective and simply represents parent-offspring conflict. Parents may want to raise all of the young associated with their nest. That may be the best way to maximize their fitness. That seems intuitive. But from the nestling's perspective, each is out for their own best interest. And if food is limited, parental care is limited, if they can get rid of the competition, in the long run this may maximize their fitness. Well, if you look at sulids, birds referred to as the boobies, in the mast boobie, the parents are unable to prevent siblicidal aggression between the chicks. The first hatch chick typically kills the younger chick at a very early stage. And you can see that from the figure here, the mast boobie with mast boobie young, the proportion of early siblicides is 100% in one study. But if you look at blue-footed boobies, the parents are able to successfully prevent the aggressive behaviors early on, and this reduces the siblicide rates to almost non-existence, as you can see from this data here. But interesting cross-fostering studies have led to predicted outcomes that indicate that this is a combination of the aggressiveness of the young and the parental capability to suppress that aggressiveness. So when mast boobie parents are put in control of blue-footed boobie young, the blue-footed boobie young are able to express these aggressive behaviors. The mast boobie parents are unable to keep this from happening, but the blue-footed boobie young are not as aggressive as the mast boobie young, and so you do see somewhat reduced patterns compared to what would happen if it was a mast boobie nest of young. However, if you look at the blue-footed boobie parents taking care of mast boobie young, you see something that's quite interesting. The blue-footed boobie parents are much more capable at suppressing the aggressive interactions of the highly aggressive mast boobie offspring, which leads to much reduced early siblicide. So there does appear to be some conflict of interest between the parents and the offspring's aggression, and this varies across these two closely related species. Well, are there certain circumstances in which siblicide could be adaptive? Could it adaptively be eliminating weak individuals? In this case, we're talking about what is sometimes referred to as adaptive brood reduction. And there are two ways in which this could be adaptive. In one situation, it could be adaptive if the organisms are living in very uncertain environments. So all the individuals in the population lay a number of eggs for a good year. Okay, well, what happens if it turns out to be a good year? Well, then everybody survives. However, if it turns out to be a bad year and there's not enough food to go around to feed all of the young in the nest that hatch, you want to increase the investment and survival of just the strongest individuals. If there's not enough food to go around to all individuals, if you do try to spread that around to all individuals, that's not going to be doing your fitness any good. So what you want to do is set up a situation, a competitive situation, where the strongest survive and the weakest individuals are the ones that are reduced from the brood, and this reduces wasted resource distribution to these weakling individuals. In another situation, another circumstance where this could be adaptive, perhaps individuals are laying extra eggs in case of hatch failure. Sometimes this is referred to as the insurance egg hypothesis. This would be an option for species that typically do have high hatch failure rates. Now, what happens if all the eggs do hatch? If this is the case, then the parents need a way, again, to reduce the brood to an appropriate size for the resource availability. And so Siblicide would then kick in, again, getting rid of the weakest individuals and reducing the brood to a manageable size so that it maximizes the fitness of the parents. Now, there are things that parents can do to set up the conditions for Siblicide and more efficient adaptive brood reduction. And one of the ways this can happen is through the production of asynchronous hatching patterns. For example, this is a picture of bee eaters, and you can tell that these bee eaters are of different ages. They're different sizes and stages of development. These are hatched on the same day. This individual here probably 2 or more days behind, and then this individual here probably at least a week behind the others. So this sets up a competitive disadvantage for some individuals and a competitive advantage for others. So that if food resources are limited, these individuals are going to be most likely to get the lion's share of the food to maintain the health. These other individuals are going to be effectively eliminated from the brood very quickly. However, in good years, the situation may be such that there's enough food to satiate these individuals, allowing food to be distributed to these weaker individuals because they're at a competitive disadvantage because they're under development, they're younger. And so these good years, they can compensate for this by getting this food and catching up to their siblings, and all the individuals will survive. Another way that this can happen in other species is the females can manipulate the amount of yolk and the amount of androgens or aggressive hormones in the firstborn individuals to make them more aggressive and bigger individuals, to give them a competitive edge and outcompete their siblings in cases where there's not enough food to go around. Studies of cattle egrets have indicated that Siblicide and asynchronous hatching is adaptive. These birds normally lay eggs and begin incubating those eggs right away, and that produces asynchronous hatching young. But you can experimentally manipulate broods to put in nestlings of equal size that will mimic a synchronous nesting situation. And in those circumstances, there are fewer survivors per nest. Then if you compare normal asynchronous hatching that occurs in nature and exaggerating that asynchronous hatching, you see that the mean number of survivors per nest is the same. But in the exaggerated asynchrony, to be able to pull that off, you have to bring actually more food per day, which reduces the parental efficiency. So this is a study that experimentally demonstrates that asynchronous hatching leads to the production of the greatest number of survivors per nest. Synchronous hatching lowers that considerably, and exaggerated asynchronous nesting can pull off the same number of survivors per nest, but it puts more stress on the parents. Let's move on to parental favoritism. Sometimes you will see at nests uneven feeding rates, food being delivered to some nestlings at a higher rate than others. Adults oftentimes feed the loudest, most aggressive young, and this perhaps represents them feeding what they see as a better investment in some young that have maybe higher reproductive value. This has been demonstrated in American robins. Another possibility is that you're just feeding the young that are in the most need, and we'll talk about that shortly. But let's first look at this idea that they may be feeding the individuals that appear to represent the highest probability of success, those with the best value. One of the signs that may indicate this is the bright reddish coloration seen in the gape of some birds. This is carotenoid color based, which is linked to the functionality of an immune system. So carotenoids are used in the immune system, and if an individual is capable of letting those carotenoids go to color something like a gape, that's basically a signal to the parents, hey, I'm healthy, I don't need to use these carotenoids in the immune system, so I deserve more food. If you look at nestling barn swallows, their gape signals health to parents apparently. In one experimental study, they manipulated individuals by giving them red food coloring around their gape, and that increased the amount of food that was delivered to these individuals, as you can see from the data here. Controls were yellow gapes or just water, and there was no significant difference before or after treatment in the feedings per hour. Now, one interpretation of studies like this is that, well, by making the mouths redder, it may not necessarily mean that the parents are recognizing that as a signal of the quality of the individual. It may just get their attention more efficiently, and that is why they may feed those individuals more. And it's not necessarily that they're linking that signal to some adaptive scenario. In alpine swifts, the young birds have ultraviolet light reflecting from their bare skin before they get feathers. And this appears to be a very strong signal associated with the size of those nestlings. And size of nestlings is a very strong correlate to how successful they're going to be once they fledge. It's a good predictor of survivorship. And so this would, again, be a good, honest signal to the parents, the return in their investment that they're going to get from these young. Here you can see the relative nestling size has got a very strong relationship with the amount of UV reflectance. And in experiments where they reduce the UV reflectance of some young, in times of low food availability, the parents fed the individuals with this higher UV expression more. Now, alternatively, we mentioned that potentially parental favoritism may shift in the opposite direction. Maybe they're feeding young that are in the most need. This would allow the more efficient distribution to all of the young likely to survive in a nest. And in these circumstances, if the siblings are full siblings and 50% related to each other, it's in their best interest to only beg when they really need food, and when they're satiated, to beg less, so that the individuals in the brood that have the greatest need get the food, which increases their survival. And we'll talk more about this in the next section. This is an example of kin selection, behaviors that lead to greater survivorship of closely related individuals, which obviously increases the fitness of the individuals performing this behavior, because individuals that are closely related share many of the same genes that you do, so increasing their survivorship helps your fitness. So in review, Siblicide may in some circumstances represent parent-offspring conflict. What is best for the parent's fitness may not always be in the same fitness goal what's best for the offspring. Siblicide may represent adaptive brood reduction in some cases. In cases where there's unpredictable environments, parents try to produce the number of young assuming that it's going to be a good year, but if it turns out to be a bad year, brood reduction will occur that will reduce the brood to a situation where it's more manageable and they can have some reproductive success with those individuals most likely to survive. So you're not wasting limited resources on the weakest individuals. Brood reduction could also be adaptive in the cases of species that oftentimes have hatch failure. They may lay extra eggs that represent insurance eggs. And in most cases, some eggs won't hatch, and so you'll end up with a clutch size that's appropriate for the resources. However, if you lay more eggs than you can care for, and they all hatch, then there's a problem. And brood reduction would allow the brood to be reduced to a more manageable level for the young that might be the best thing to maximize their fitness. There are ways that brood reduction can be made more efficient by having asynchronous hatching, so that some young are at a competitive advantage over others, so that if there are not enough resources to go around, only the strongest will survive. Parents can also set this up, the females can set this up by an uneven distribution of egg resources in the first laid eggs. They may get more yolk, more protein, more hormones that give them a more aggressive behavior, which again may give them a competitive ability and will speed up brood reduction. And lastly, we talked about parental favoritism. In some cases, parents will feed young that represent the best investment, potentially, or they may feed the young most in need. And there's a lot of research right now trying to sort among these two alternatives. In situations where there's a lot of competition for limiting resources, you might expect the former. You might expect the latter in cases where all of the young have a good chance of surviving, and you want to have an even distribution so that all of the young have the best opportunity to survive.